Most transplant centers absolutely stink, okay? They're terrible. They're not worth their salt. They're not doing their job, and we deserve better. That's the basic answer. However, if you've been watching my most recent video series entitled, Why Didn't They Tell Me That? Let me say to begin with, thank you for your tremendous support on that. Most of you already understand that actually started out as a much longer video consisting of about 54 or so minutes where I really went through a bunch of comments on what people like you have said concerning the things they wish they have known before transplant. Now, since that time, I've taken that and started to break it up into 2 and 3 minute segments and put them out in separate videos, and they've received a ton of support and a ton of really engagement since that point in time. Most of that engagement has been 100% positive, where people chip in and say, hey, look, I wish I'd known that too, or they may add to that. Well, I did know that, but I didn't know this, and so forth. And I've really enjoyed your feedback on that, and that will probably ultimately result in another video coming out at some point in the very near future. But with that being said, I want to answer the most common question I'm actually asked concerning that video or that series of videos, and that is basically, Jim, why are we not told that in the beginning? Why is it they're not telling us all this stuff that we really need to know? Now, the simple answer to that comes down to one thing, and that is most transplant centers absolutely stink, okay? They're terrible. They're not worth their salt. They're not doing their job, and we deserve better. That's the basic answer. However, that's not actually the true answer. The reason we're not learning this stuff up front comes down to a couple to 3 different reasons. I think mainly 2 reasons, and the first one is mainly just simply time constraints, okay? When you're going through your pre-transplant evaluation process, and they include in that some educational type materials, oftentimes that consists of sitting down in a boardroom in a group of a bunch of different people there and being taught by several doctors, nurses, coordinators, whoever, kind of the basics of transplant. During that period of time, they might give you a folder where they give you a ton of information that's in written form that kind of gives you all the ins and outs of transplants, the requirements of it, the things they're going to expect of you, and some of the things, and I said some of the things that you may face post-transplant. But in the time that they're allotted, which typically does only consist of a few hours, maybe on a day or 2, they're just not able to tell you all of that. Now, when you add into the addition of that the fact that if it's like my transplant center, oftentimes those classes are rotated between educators. It's just really people who are coming in their spare time, doctors who are not on call, or nurses or coordinators who are not working a case in that moment, who are stepping in and doing those things randomly, and they really don't have a lot of communication or a lot of skill as far as what's been taught and what hasn't. So because of that, oftentimes there are some blank spots. There are some areas that they just don't get around to touching because they just don't have the time to do that, okay? And I think that's probably the main reason why we don't always hear all of these things. But what has come out of the video series, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Touchstone, is a lot of people are commenting below the videos and saying, well, I didn't know that either. I wish I had known that. Or on the opposite, there have been a number of people that step in and say, look, I knew that. My transplant team is great. They taught me everything. Well, I doubt they taught you everything, but I'm thankful that many transplant centers really are doing a great job at that. But time is still a constraint for them. Number 2, not only time constraints, but oftentimes our own health. I can speak for myself and for so many of the hundreds of patients I've worked with personally, face to face. It is very difficult when you're in stage 4 or whatever the failure is you're in. For me, heart, it was called stage 4 heart failure. It is very difficult to go and sit in the classroom or in any situation, even if they come to the patient room and try to educate you. It is nearly impossible to take everything in, to absorb that, or to really get it, because this is not a situation where just simple intellect or hearing the knowledge is going to soak in completely. No, it really comes from someone who's been there and doing that. And oftentimes these coordinators, these doctors, they've obviously not ever been there and done that for themselves. That's not a bad thing, not a knock on them, but they haven't. And it's so hard when you're not feeling well. If you're like I was pre-transplant, you're kind of doped up a little bit. You're dealing with an awful lot. You're overwhelmed. And so it's nearly impossible to absorb all these things. So it may be the case that some of our transplant centers probably did a really good job educating us, But in the end, you just can't take all that in. You can't absorb all that information, especially because you're sick. And even if you got good family members and caregivers surrounding you at that point where they're sitting in the room, you're listening to those things, maybe even taking down some notes, they're not going to absorb it all either, because in that situation, it's such a shock. It's such a new thing to us. We don't know what to ask, and they don't know what to answer without a question. And so it just doesn't always get taught in that way. But in the end of things, I think most transplant centers really do work hard to make this better and better. And I know myself as a transplant educator working with UAB from time to time, I know we have really worked hard over there to try to get things lined up where people just learn the most they possibly can in that short and small window of time. In addition to that, that's what this series, that's what my over 1,000 videos here on the channel have always been about anyway. It's just been about trying to fill in those gaps, okay? Trying to supplement the material that's just not available. So let me say again to each of you who have supported that, who have commented, who have really made that whole series better by giving your information, sharing your what we call 2 cents there. Thank you again for that. I appreciate your tremendous support. But when it comes to answering the question why we're not told better, it's often just time, and it's often the fact that we're just so sick, we just can't hear it. So thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, stay stronger, my friends.